They called it the cradle, not because it was gentle or warm or safe. They called it the cradle because it was where they put things they wanted to forget. A living world, buried beneath a dying star, sealed with technology so advanced it had no name. And into the cradle, 470 years ago, Tetro, Uwasa. The Vethrak were the oldest civilization in the known galaxy. They had mapped 2,000 star systems before humans discovered fire. They had built ring worlds before we learned to smelt iron. And when they found Earth, crawling with 7 billion strange, war-obsessed creatures, they did not conquer us, did not enslave us, did not even bother to negotiate. They simply relocated us. 12 million humans, chosen by algorithms we didn't understand, scooped from cities, farms, forests, and oceans in the span of a single night. They took us from our homes without a word. They dropped us into the cradle without an explanation, and then they sealed the door. Year 0. That was what the survivors called it. The first generation who woke up in a place that should not exist. A world wrapped in stone, lit by a pale amber glow that came from nowhere and everywhere. Tunnels that breathed, corridors that shifted, walls that watched. The cradle was not a prison in the way humans understood prisons. It was alive, not in the way a dog is alive or a tree is alive. It was alive the way a storm is alive. Purposeful, patient, endlessly creative in its cruelty. The first 100 died within weeks, not from starvation, not from violence. They died from despair. The cradles seemed to understand despair. It seemed to feed on it. Tunnels would collapse exactly when hope was found. Water sources would dry up the moment a community formed around them. Light would vanish precisely when children needed it most. The survivors called it malicious, but it was not malicious. It was simply honest. The cradle was a test, though no one told the humans that. The Vethrak had used it before, on 3 other species. All 3 had lasted fewer than 2 generations. The Vethrak had a word for what they believed happened to species in the cradle. Translated loosely, it meant the revealing of what is truly there. They expected to find nothing truly there in humans. They were wrong. If you're finding this story compelling, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Year 3. A man named Desmond Ashabe, formerly a civil engineer from Lagos, Nigeria, pressed his hand against a pulsing wall and held it there for 6 hours. His companions thought he had lost his mind. He had not lost his mind. He was listening. Desmond had noticed something the others had not. The walls vibrated at different frequencies, depending on what was behind them. Hollow spaces produced a low resonance. Solid rock produced a higher one. The cradle wasn't trying to hide its structure from them. It simply hadn't expected anyone to notice. Desmond began mapping, not with instruments. He had no instruments. He mapped with his palms, his body feet, his cheek pressed against stone. He mapped with sound, with tapping rhythms, with the echo of his own voice. Within a year, he had produced the first partial map of the cradle's first layer. He called it Layer 1, because he suspected there were more. He was right. There were 7. Desmond's map saved 400 lives in Year 4 alone, when the cradle reconfigured its corridors for the first time. What others saw as catastrophe, Desmond saw as data. The cradle had moved, yes, but it had moved according to rules, and rules, Desmond told his people with exhausted certainty, can be learned. Year 11. A woman named Sunli, formerly a molecular biologist from Chengdu, discovered that the amber light was not random. It was responsive. She had been trying to grow food in the dim glow for years, failing repeatedly, until she noticed that the light intensified when she sang. Not music specifically. Vibration. The cradle responded to vibration. Sunli began experimenting with sound frequencies and discovered something that changed everything. Certain tones caused specific patches of the cradle's walls to become permeable. Others caused the floor to produce moisture, and one very specific combination of 3 sustained tones caused something remarkable. The walls began to weep a slow, thick substance that tasted of iron and salt. It was not pleasant, but it was rich in minerals and calories. They called it cradle milk, a name that made most people grimace. But no one went hungry the week Sunli made her discovery. And for the first time in 11 years, children stopped crying at night. Year 19. The first child born in the cradle turned 17 and walked into a part of the dungeon no adult had entered. Her name was Raya, a Shabi, daughter of Desmond. She had grown up reading her father's maps, the way other children read fairy tales. She had grown up listening to Sunli's frequencies, the way other children listened to music. She had never known Earth. The cradle was not a prison to her. It was simply the world. And worlds, she had decided at the age of 5, were meant to be explored. Raya walked into the dark for 6 days and came back with something astonishing. A stone carved with Vethrak script, not ancient. Fresh. Still faintly warm to the touch. The Vethrak were watching. They had been watching the whole time. The realization hit the human communities like a physical blow. They were not forgotten. They were being observed. The cradle was not just a prison. It was a laboratory. And the Vethrak were the scientists watching the experiment unfold. The rage that followed nearly destroyed everything the survivors had built. 3 communities went to war with each other in year 20, fighting over the single captured stone, each group believing the others would use it against them. 47 people died in 3 weeks. The cradle celebrated in the way it always did. It grew. A new layer opened beneath them, vast and terrifying and full of new horrors. Layer 2. The oldest of the first generation were dying now. They gathered the young around them and said the same thing in different languages. We do not have much time. Learn what we learned. Improve what we built. Do not stop. And then they died. And the young picked up their tools, their maps, their songs, and they did not stop. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who loves a good underdog story. Subscribe if you want to follow humanity's journey through the cradle. Year 47. 3 distinct human factions had emerged in the cradle. The Mappas followed Desmond's legacy, obsessed with understanding the dungeon's physical structure. The Singers followed Sunli's legacy, mastering the acoustic and vibrational language of the cradle. The Hunters were something new entirely. They had emerged from the children who grew up in Layer 2. Layer 2 was nothing like Layer 1. Layer 1 had been cold and confusing, and Layer 2 was actively hostile. It was full of creatures that should not have existed. Things that looked like they had been designed specifically to kill humans. Multi-limbed predators that hunted by body heat. Swarms of razor-edged organisms that communicated through electric pulses. And something the hunters simply called the Watcher. A creature so large that its body formed part of the corridor walls. A creature so old that fungi grew on its skin like moss on stone. A creature that had killed 11 humans before a hunter named Bika Ose learned its one weakness. It was afraid of fire. Not fire itself. The cradle was too damp for sustained open flame, but the electromagnetic signature of fire, the specific light frequency of combustion. Bika built a device from salvaged materials, scavenged metals, and knowledge stolen from the cradle itself. A lamp that produced firelight without fire. The Watcher froze when it was activated. Every time, without exception. Bika did not know why. Neither did anyone else. But they built more lamps, and the hunters began to move through Layer 2 like ghosts, their fire lamps casting orange light on creatures that had never been afraid before. The mappers mapped, the singers sang, the hunters hunted, and slowly, the cradle began to feel less like a prison. Year 83. A mapper named Tomas Vega, working at the boundary between Layer 2 and the theoretical Layer 3, discovered something that changed the entire theory of the cradle. He found a room, not a corridor, not a passage, not a chamber formed by geological accident. A room, perfectly square, smooth walls, high ceiling, and in the center of the room, a plinth of black stone. On T-plinth, something that looked like it was waiting to be picked up. It was a sphere, dark and faintly warm, about the size of a human fist. Tomas reached for it. His hand passed through it. He pulled his hand back. He tried again. His hand passed through it again. He sat down on the floor, stared at the sphere, and started talking to it. He didn't know why it felt right. He talked for 3 hours. He told it about his grandmother, who had been taken from her village in Guatemala. He told it about the smell of rain on hot pavement, which he had never actually smelled himself, but which his mother had described to him so many times he felt like a memory. He told it about the maps, about the Watcher, about Bika's lamp. He told it about the 47 who died in the war over the stone. He told it about the children who were growing up in the cradle and calling it home. When he finished, the sphere was solid. It picketed up. It was the first key. Year 100. Humanity in the cradle had reached a population of 40,000, 3 generations deep. They had built something extraordinary. The communities were linked now by a network of mapped and maintained corridors, lit by Singer-maintained acoustic lighting, protected by Hunter Patrol. They had agriculture of a kind. Fungi farms, moss cultivation, the cradle milk harvest. They had medicine, a brutal, improvised, constantly evolving medicine built from cradle by. They had governance, messy, loud, frequently broken, endlessly argued over, stubbornly functional. They had culture, stories, songs, artwork carved into walls, a dozen languages slowly merging into one. And they had the sphere. The first key. The mappers had spent 17 years trying to understand what the sphere was. The singers had spent years trying to play music at it, through it, around it. The hunters had tried to use it as a weapon. Nothing worked. The sphere simply sat in its place of honor, warm to the touch, solid but seemingly purposeless. A monument to the day Tomas Vega talked to an object for 3 hours. Then a girl named Amara, age 9, picked it up and asked it a question. Not a philosophical question, not a technical question. She asked, "Where's the next room?" The sphere lit up, and a map appeared on the wall. A map of Layer 3. In the silence that followed, the oldest surviving member of the first generation, a woman of 94 named Yuki Tanaka, formerly a schoolteacher from Osaka, began to laugh. It took her companions a long moment to understand why. The cradle didn't respond to analysis. It didn't respond to force. It didn't respond to science. It responded to curiosity. Pure, honest, childlike curiosity. Yuki Tanaka laughed until she cried. Then she died 3 days later, still smiling. If you're hooked on this story, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. Like this video and share it with a friend who needs to hear that humans are unstoppable. Year 152. Layer 3 was not what anyone expected. It was beautiful. After the grim stone of Layer 1 and the hostile darkness of Layer 2, Layer 3 was flooded with a deep blue luminescence that had no visible source. The corridors were wide and tall and carved with script that covered every surface. Floor to ceiling, corner to corner, unbroken and endless. The first mappers to enter Layer 3 spent 3 weeks simply standing and reading, or trying to read. The script was Velthori. That much was clear. But Velthori had not been spoken by humans before. It had never needed to be. The humans of the cradle knew the name Velthori, the way you know the name of a god. As a concept more than a reality, as a source of myth rather than knowledge. But they had the stone that Raya Asebe had brought back from her first expedition. They had studied it for 130 years. They had guessed at letter forms, at syntax, at grammatical structure. And when the first scholar of Layer 3 stood in that blue light and looked at the walls, she found she understood more than she expected. Her name was Dr. Priya Nair, 5th generation, trained in everything her predecessors had managed to document. She read slowly. Her hands shook. She read what was written, and she turned to the people behind her and said, very quietly, "It is a history. The history of every species that has ever been put in the cradle." Year 154. Dr. Priya Nair spent 2 years translating. Her notes filled 300 handmade books. The history written on the walls of Layer 3 told the story of 3 species before humanity. The Keth, insectoid, brilliant, who had reached Layer 3 in 40 years and been destroyed by their own internal conflicts in Layer 4. The Ovali, plant-like, patient, who had spent 200 years in Layer 2 before. A cascade failure in their biological systems ended their civilization quietly and completely. The Shenvior, crystalline, ancient, who had reached Layer 5 in 300 years, before vanishing from the record entirely. Cause unknown. Humanity had outlasted 2 of the 3 previous species simply by surviving to year 150. But survival was not the test. Priya read deeper. She found the original design documents for the cradle, written by the Vethrak founder architects 4,000 years ago. She found the purpose statement. She translated it 3 times to be sure. The cradle was not a prison, not precisely. It was a refinement engine. The Vethrak believed that species only revealed their true nature under pressure. Not moderate pressure, not inconvenience. Existential, relentless, inescapable pressure. The cradle was designed to produce 3 outcomes. The species collapses. They are not ready. The Vethrak move on. The species survives but does not grow. They are static. Useful but not equal. The species survives and transforms. They become something new. Something the Vethrak could not predict. In 4,000 years of using the cradle, the 3rd outcome had never happened. Not once. Not until now. Year 200. The population of humanity in the cradle had reached 120,000. They spanned 5 layers now. Layer 1 had become something like a city, loud and crowded and full of the smell of fungi bread. Layer 2 had been tamed. The Watcher itself finally communicated with in year 180 by a singer who spent 6 months learning to mimic its electromagnetic language. Layer 3 was a library, a temple, a school, the most sacred space in the cradle. Layer 4 was a frontier, dangerous and thrilling, full of hunters whose fire lamps had evolved into something sophisticated. Layer 5 was a mystery. No human had entered it and returned. Not yet. But they were planning. Year 200 was also the year humans made a discovery that the Vethrak had not anticipated. The cradle was not just alive in the metaphorical sense. It had something that functioned like a nervous system, a distributed biological network woven through every wall, every floor, every corridor. Not intelligent in the way humans were intelligent, but aware, responsive, capable of something resembling learning. The cradle was learning from the humans who lived inside it, and after 200 years, it had changed. The creatures of Layer 2 were less aggressive now. The corridor shifts of Layer 1 had slowed, become more predictable, almost gently. The amber light had warmed, slightly, barely perceptibly. But measurably, the cradle was, in its alien and incomprehensible way, adapting to its residents. Not the other way around. A singer named Kofi Mensah, who'd spent 30 years studying the cradle's nervous system, said something in a lecture that was repeated for generations. He said, "We have been treating the cradle like an obstacle. We should have been treating it like a student." Year 260. The first human entered Layer 5 and returned. Her name was Sable. No family name. She had chosen to be called only Sable, the way the hunters of her generation had adopted single names as a mark of their identity. She was 28 years old, small, quiet, and terrifying in the way only truly competent people are terrifying. She spent 43 days in Layer 5 alone. When she returned, she was changed in a way that was hard to describe. She moved differently. She was quieter. Her eyes tracked things that weren't there, but she was alive. And she had brought back knowledge. Layer 5 was different from anything that had come before. It was not dark, not hostile, not full of creatures. It was empty. Perfectly, completely, impossibly empty. No creatures, no script on the walls, no ambient biological activity. Nothing but smooth dark stone in every direction, and one thing in the very center of Layer 5. A door. Not a dungeon door, not an archway, not a passage. A door with a handle, like something from a human house. Sable had not opened it. She had stood before it for 3 days. She had talked to it, the way Tomas Vega had talked to the sphere. She had told it everything. The whole 400-year history of humanity in the cradle. The deaths, the discoveries, the wars, the songs, the children, the maps, the Watcher, the sphere. Dr. Priya Nair's translations. The way the amber light had warmed, the way the cradle had begun, slowly and strangely, to feel like home. When she finished, the door did not open, but a light appeared beneath it, and Sable returned to tell the others. It was time. If you've made it this far, you already know this story is something special. Like, share, and subscribe, so we can keep telling the stories that matter. Year 470. The Council of the Cradle met in Layer 3, as it always did for matters of importance. 400 years of accumulated tradition had made the Layer 3 library into something that would have been unrecognizable to Desmond Akave or Sun Li, or Raya Asep. It was vast, lit by a network of Singer-maintained bioluminescence, lined with shelf after shelf of handmade books, carved tablets, pressed fiber sheets covered in the merged language that the humans of the Cradle had developed over 4 centuries. It smelled of old paper and fungi oil and the faint, warm mineral scent of the Cradle itself. The council was made up of 12 people, 1 from each major community. A mapper, 3 singers, 2 hunters, a scholar, a grower, a healer, a keeper of records, and 2 children, because the Cradle's constitution, written in year 140, required that children be present at every major decision. Because children, the founders had written, remember that the future is real. The council was meeting to discuss a message, the first communication from outside in 470 years. It had arrived 6 weeks earlier, through a mechanism no one had expected. The door in Layer 5 had opened, not all the way, not invitingly. A crack, the width of a hand, and through that crack, a single written message had been pushed. On Velthari material, in Velthari script, the scholar present, a woman named Ilara Voss, 8th generation descendant of a German engineer who had been taken from Hamburg in the original displacement, had translated it in 4 hours. She had then sat very quietly for another 3 hours before presenting her translation to the council. The message said, "Impressive performance. Subspecies, you have exceeded the established parameters of the Cradle experiment. However, you remain classified as a contained population. You have been offered the opportunity to communicate. If you wish to negotiate your status, send a representative. Be advised, the door will open once. If your representative is not ready, it will not open again." The council had been arguing about the message for 6 weeks. The argument was not about whether to respond. Everyone agreed they should respond. The argument was about what to say, and who should say it. The hunters wanted to send their best fighter, arguing that the Velthari would respect strength. The scholars wanted to send a linguist, arguing that language was the battlefield that mattered. The singers wanted to send a master of the Cradle's acoustic language, arguing that demonstrating mastery of the Dungeon Zone systems would show capability more than any words could. The mappers argued for sending Tomas Viega's great-great-granddaughter, Lena Vega, because the Vega family had always understood things the rest of them missed. Lena Vega, who was 31 and had the unsettling habit of knowing what you were going to say before you said it, sat in the corner of the chamber and said nothing. She had been saying nothing for 6 weeks. The debate had grown louder each day. The children on the council had been watching the adults argue, and one of them, a 13-year-old boy named Ori, whose grandmother was a hunter, had grown visibly bored. In the 42nd day of debate, Ori interrupted. He said, "Why are we deciding who to send? We should be deciding what we are." The room went quiet. Ori continued, with the particular confidence of someone who has not yet learned to second-guess themselves. He said, "They ask us to send a representative. That means one person, but we are not one person. We have never been one person. We are mappers and singers and hunters and scholars and growers and healers. We are 8 generations of people who survived everything the Cradle threw at us. We survived because we were all of those things at once, not just one of them. If we send one person to speak for us, we are lying about what we are. We should send all of us." The silence lasted a long time. Lena Vega, in her corner, smiled. The vote was not close. Year 470, 48th day after the message. The door opened. All the way, this time. On the other side was a chamber that dwarfed anything in the Cradle. A space so large the ceiling was not visible, lit with a cold white light that made everything look surgical. And in that chamber, seated behind a structure that might have been a table, were three The humans had never seen a Valkyrie before. They were at nearly 3 meters, with 4 limbs and 2 supplementary manipulators that hung at their sides when not in use. Their faces were flat and wide, dominated by large compound eyes of deep amber. They wore no visible clothing in the human sense, but their bodies were covered in patterns that shifted slowly, like text being rewritten in real time. The first Valkyrie to speak used a device that translated its words into the merged human language. Imperfectly, but functionally. It said, "We expected one." Lena Vega, who stood at the front of the delegation of 240 humans, said, "We know." The Valkyrie said, "You were told to send a representative." Lena said, "We did. We sent all of us." The Valkyrie's patterns shifted rapidly. The other two conferred in a language the device did not translate. Then the first one said, "This is irregular," Lena said. 470 years of irregular, and we're just getting started. Ah. Long pause. Then the Valkyrie said, "You are not what the cradle was designed to produce." Lena said, "What was it designed to produce?" The Valkyrie said, "Survivors. Organized, disciplined, capable, ready to be integrated into the galactic order as a productive but manageable civilization," Lena said. "And what did it produce instead?" Another pause. Longer this time. The Valkyrie's pattern stilled completely, which, the humans would later learn, meant something significant. The Valkyrie said, "Something we do not have a word for." Lena said, "We do." She turned to the 240 people behind her, the mappers, with their rolled charts and their pattern-reading hands. The singers, who had been quietly vibrating the walls of the chamber since they entered, reading the Valkyrie room the way Sonli had read the cradle 4 centuries ago. The hunters, who had already identified every exit, every structural weakness, the scholars, who had been listening to the Valkyrie's untranslated conference with growing comprehension, the growers and the healers and the keepers and the children, all of them. Looking back at her, Lena turned to the Valkyrie and said, "We call it human. Don't stop here. Like this video, subscribe, and share it with everyone you know. This story belongs to all of us." Year 470. The negotiations lasted 11 days. The Valkyrie had come prepared to process a single entity. Their protocols, 4,000 years old, assumed that a species emerging from the cradle would present a leader, a hierarchy, a clear decision-making structure that could be analyzed, cataloged, and integrated into the existing galactic framework. What they got was 240 people who kept consulting each other, who argued openly in front of the Valkyrie, who changed their positions based on new information without embarrassment, who sent children to ask questions that the adults had decided were too important to ask tactfully. The Valkyrie were deeply, visibly, repeatedly unsettled. On the 3rd day, the lead Valkyrie said, "Your decision-making process is inefficient." Lena said, "Our decision-making process is honest," the Valkyrie said. "The distinction is irrelevant." A scholar named Damon Assay, distant descendant of Bika the Hunter, said, "With respect, that distinction is the only thing that's ever been relevant." On the 5th day, the Valkyrie asked a question that seemed small, but was not. They asked, "What do you want?" The humans had prepared for this. They had spent 6 weeks arguing about what to say to the Valkyrie, but they had spent 470 years answering the question of what they wanted. Lena said, "We want to go back," the Valkyrie said. "To Earth," Lena said. "Eventually, but first, we want to understand what happened to it, to the 8 billion people who were left behind, to the centuries that passed while we were in here. We want the truth about what you did to our species and why, and we want the right to decide what happens next. Not to be managed, not to be integrated on your terms. The right to decide." The Valkyrie were quiet for a long time. "Tentei sighed, "You understand that you are one species among thousands," Lena said. "We understand that," the Valkyrie said. "You understand that we have existed for longer than your sun has been stable," Lena said. "We understand that too," the Valkyrie said. "Then you must understand that your wants are small in the context of what we manage," Lena said. "With respect, That's exactly what someone says when they want to avoid giving someone what they're owed. She paused. Tense aside, you put 12 million people in a box and watched what happened. You did it because you thought you could predict the answer. You couldn't. We are not the answer you predicted. We are not survivors. We are not a manageable civilization. We are the thing that happened when you underestimated us for 470 years, and we would like, very politely and very firmly, to be treated accordingly. On the 9th day, a young Vethrak administrator, who had been silent for the entire negotiation, asked to speak. This was irregular. The lead Vethrak indicated it with the shifting of patterns. The young Vethrak said, in careful translated language, I have reviewed the full record of the cradle. All 7 layers. All 470 years. I have reviewed the histories of the Keth, the Orvali, and the Shenvio. I would like to state, for the formal record, that the humans of the cradle have done something that has no precedent in our 4,000-year history. They named the cradle's nervous system. They communicated with it. They changed it. The cradle is different because of them. Not adapted around them. Not merely modified. The cradle has grown new systems that did not exist before. Biological pathways that appear to be responses to human presence specifically. I am not qualified to characterize what this means, but I believe it should be characterized. The lead Vethrak's patterns stilled again. The young Vethrak continued. I also wish to note that I have been listening to the humans in this room for 9 days. I have not heard them lie. Not once. Not even to make themselves seem stronger. I think that is also worth noting. On the 11th day, the lead Vethrak said to Lena, You asked for the truth. Lena said, Yes. The Vethrak said, It is not simple. Lena said, The best truths never are. We have 470 years of practice with complicated truths. We can handle more. The Vethrak said, Earth is intact. Your species, on the surface, is intact. They do not know you are taken. Lena went very still. The Vethrak said, The 12 million who were placed in the cradle were removed from the population record, classified as lost to a natural disaster. Your families continued. Your civilization continued. They have developed on their own trajectory for 4 centuries. They are not the people you remember. The children who were born in Layer 3 and Layer 5 and Layer 7, 2 parents who spoke of Guatemala and Lagos and Osaka and Chengdu, are the children of a people who no longer exist in the form they were taken. Earth is not the planet your ancestors left. It is 470 years changed. Lena absorbed this. The 240 people behind her absorbed this. Some of them were crying. Some were stone-faced. Some were doing quick mental calculations, Lena said. Then we have a lot of catching up to do. Like this video, if you're still here, still listening, still subscribe and share because this story is just beginning. Year 470. After the negotiations, the agreement that emerged from the 11 days was not what the Vethrak had planned for. Their integration protocols assumed a species would accept a designated tier in the galactic hierarchy. Tier 7. They had intended for the humans. Resource-capable, scientifically useful, culturally interesting, but politically managed. Humanity had, over 11 days, quietly and firmly declined Tier 7. They had also declined Tier 6. They had expressed interest in sitting outside the tier system entirely until they had sufficient information to make an informed decision. Vethrak had no protocol for that. The young Vethrak administrator had suggested creating one. The lead Vethrak had been quiet for a very long time. Then it had said something that the human scholars translated with careful uncertainty. The closest human equivalent, Damon Asay, concluded after 3 days of analysis, was, We may have made an error in our assumptions, which, he noted, was the closest thing to an apology a 4,000-year-old civilization had ever offered anyone. The terms of the agreement were simple. The humans of the cradle would be returned to contact with Earth. The full history of the displacement would be disclosed to both populations. The Vethrak would provide translation support, technology transfer within agreed limits, and access to the Galactic Archive for a period of assessment. In return, humanity asked for one thing beyond logistics. They asked for the cradle. The Vethrak were surprised by this, Lena explained. "The cradle is ours," she said. "We lived in it for 470 years. We named it. We changed it. It changed with us. You built it as a test. We turned it into a civilization. That's not a small thing. We're not asking you to give it to us as a trophy. We're asking because the cradle is still alive, and we are the only ones who know how to listen to it, and because leaving it behind would be like leaving behind a member of our community. Which," she added, "is not something we do." The Vethrak agreed. The young administrator, who would later become significant in ways this history cannot yet describe, asked one more question before the negotiations formally closed. "Asked Lina, in 470 years, did you ever stop hoping?" Lina looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the 240 people behind her, the mappers who had learned to read stone-like text, the singers who had taught the cradle to be warm, the hunters who had made friends of predators, the scholars who had translated the history of species who never got out, the growers who had fed a civilization on sound and stone, the healers who had built medicine from nothing in the dark, the children who called the dungeon home and meant it. She looked back at the young Vethrak and said, "Stopping was never one of the options. Year 470. They return." The first humans to step outside the cradle after 4 centuries did so in a group of 12. Not because the others couldn't come, not because of protocol, but because Lina had asked them to go slowly. She had said, "We have been in the dark for 470 years. Let's not stumble into the light." The 12th walked out into a corridor that led to the surface of the world that housed the cradle. They had been told it was a moon, airless, barren, but with a view. They stood on the surface, in Vethrak-provided suits, and looked up. Stars, more stars than any of them had ever imagined. Not the amber glow of the cradle, not the blue luminescence of Layer 3. The real sky, old and vast and indifferent, in the beautiful way that only the universe can be indifferent. A singer named Mira, who was 7 months pregnant and had absolutely refused to stay behind, began to hum. Not one of the cradle frequencies, not a maintenance tone or a communication signal, just a sound, low and steady and human. The others joined her, one by one, standing on the surface of an airless moon, in suits borrowed from the oldest civilization in the galaxy, looking at a sky their ancestors had looked at from a different world. 12 humans hummed together in the silence of space. When they went back inside, Lina asked how it felt. The hunter named Sable, who had stood before the door in Layer 5, and told it everything, who had spent more time alone in the cradle than perhaps any other living person, said, "It felt like the end of the first part." And then Lina said what would be written on the entrance to the cradle, in the merged human language and, later, in Vethrak script as well. She said, "They built this to break us. They built it to reveal what was truly there. They expected to find nothing. We spent 470 years showing them they were wrong. And we are just getting started." If this story moved you, hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that humans are extraordinary. Subscribe to follow the rest of the journey. Because this is not the end. This is the beginning of everything that comes next. The cradle still breathes. The stars still burn. Humanity is still walking forward. And it has never, not once in 470 years, stopped. Year 470. 3 months after the door opened. The Galactic Archive was not a building. It was not a database in any sense that human scholars initially understood. It was a living repository, maintained by a species called the Archivist-bound, who had volunteered 10,000 years ago to become part of the archive itself. Their biology was now so intertwined with the archive systems that separating them was no longer theoretically possible. They were, in the most literal sense, the memory of the galaxy. When Damonase first walked into the archive chamber and understood what he was looking at, he sat down on the floor and put his face in his hands. Not from grief, from the overwhelming, staggering weight of recognition. He was a scholar. He had spent his entire life in Layer 3, surrounded by 400 years of accumulated human knowledge pressed into handmade books and carved into stone. He had believed, in the quiet arrogance of someone who has read everything available to them, that he understood what knowledge looked like. He had been wrong in the most magnificent way possible. The archive contained the complete recorded history of 412 civilizations, species that had risen, flourished, transformed, declined, ended, or ascended beyond recording. Damon spent his first week in the archive simply reading titles. Not content. Just titles. On the 8th day, he found the section on humanity. Not the cradle humanity, the earth humanity. 470 years of history he had never been alive to witness. He read for 19 hours without stopping. Then he sent a message back through the communication relay that Vethrak had established. The message was 3 words. He sent, "They remembered us." Lena received the message in the temporary quarters that had been established in the outer corridor of the cradle's exit level. She read it, folded it carefully, and went to find Sable. Sable was where she usually was when she wasn't on duty, sitting at the edge of the surface access corridor, looking at the stars through the reinforced viewport. Lena sat beside her and said, "Damon says they remembered us." Sable said. "Who did?" Lena said. "Earth. The people who stayed." Sable was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Lena said, "Apparently there were stories. Legends. About 12 million people who vanished in a single night, about lights in the sky and silence afterward. About the ones who were taken. The stories changed over 400 years, the way stories do. Some of them became myths. Some became religions. Some became warnings. Some became songs, but the core of them stayed the same." Sable said. "What was the core?" Lena said. "That they were not forgotten, that wherever they went, they were still ours. That someday they might come back." Sable looked at the stars for a long time. "Tensei sighed we should tell them soon," Lena said. "We will. We just need to figure out how to save 470 years in a way that doesn't break people," Sable said. "There is no way that doesn't break people a little," Lena said. "I know." She paused. Then she said, "But we survived the cradle. I think we can survive being found. If you're still with us, you already know what makes humans different. Like and subscribe so you're here for the reunion that changes everything." Year 470. 5 months after the door opened, the young Vethrak administrator's name, translated as closely as human phonology allowed, was Velsra Ayad Bikome, in the months since the negotiations. Something unexpected, not a friend. Exactly. The concept of friendship between species 4,000 years apart in development was complicated enough to fill several of the scholars' books, but something adjacent to a friend. An interested party. A genuine one. Velsorin had requested and been granted permission to spend time in the cradle. Not in the exit corridors or the diplomatic chambers. In the cradle itself and Telea's, he walked through Layer 1 with a mapper named Cassian, who narrated the history of every junction and chamber they passed through, with the practiced ease of someone who had memorized the same tour since childhood. Velsorin's pattern text shifted constantly as he listened. He said very little. He asked precise questions when he did speak. In Layer 2, he was taken to meet the Watcher. The Watcher was very old now. The fungi on its skin had grown thick and elaborate, and it moved rarely, and when it did, the sound of it was like stones settling after an earthquake. The singer who communicated with it was a woman named Asha, who had spent 20 years learning its electromagnetic language. She introduced Velsorin to the Watcher, the way you introduce a guest to an elder. With formality, witpatin, with respect. The Watcher regarded Velsorin for a very long time. Then, it produced a signal that Asha translated as note from Ire, but not afraid, Velsorin said, quietly. "No, not afraid." The Watcher produced another signal. Asha translated it, and then looked at Velsorin, with an expression he was learning to read as surprise. She said, "It says you smell like the ones who built the walls," Velsorin said. "I am one of the ones who built the walls. My ancestors did," Asha said. "The Watcher says it has wondered, for a very long time, why the walls were built," Velsorin said. "So have I in Layer 3. Velsorin stood before the wall text for hours. He could read it without translation, of course. It was his language. But reading it here, in T's place, surrounded by 400 years of human adaptation and survival, it read differently than it would have in a Vethrak archive. He found the original purpose statement, the one Dr. Prianair had translated 200 years ago. He read it 3 times. Then he said, to no one in particular, "We were so certain." Damon Asay, who had returned from the Galactic Archive and was cataloging Layer 3 texts, said without looking up, "Certainty is comfortable. It's also usually wrong." Velsoren said, "We had evidence. 3 previous species. A consistent pattern." Damon said, "You had 3 data points." Velsoren said, "That is typically sufficient for a reliable model." Damon said, "Not when the 4th data point is us." Velsoren's pattern stilled. He said, "No, apparently not." Paus. Then he said, "I've been trying to understand what you did differently. What the specific variable was." Damon said, "Which conclusion have you reached?" Velsoren said, "I have not reached one. Every time I identify a factor, I find it is dependent on another factor, which is dependent on another, which leads back to something I cannot quantify." Damon said, "That is because it is not a variable. It is not a specific thing we did differently. It is the sum of everything we are. 400 years of making different decisions in the same impossible situation." Velsoren said, "That is not a scientific answer." Damon said, "No. But it is an honest one, and you told us 11 days ago that honesty was worth noting." Year 470. 7 months after the door opened, the communication relay went live on a Tuesday. The humans of the Cradle had kept the old Earth calendar with stubborn precision for 4 centuries, not because it was practically useful in a place with no sun cycle, but because it was theirs. The keepers of records had maintained it unbroken since year 1. It was Tuesday, late morning by the old reckoning. The communication relay linked, for the first time in 470 years, to a signal that could reach Earth. Lena sat before the relay with a prepared statement. She had written and rewritten it 37 times. She had consulted every member of the council. She had asked the children what they would want to hear if it were them. The children had said, "Tell them we are okay. Tell them first. Before anything else, tell them we are okay." Lena had built her statement around that. She activated the relay. She said, "This message is for Earth. For the people of Earth. My name is Lena Vega. I am a human being. I am speaking to you from outside your solar system. I know this is not what you expected to hear today. I know this will raise more questions than I can answer in a single message. But I want to tell you, first, before anything else, before all of the complicated truth that comes after. We are okay. The ones who were taken. The ones who disappeared 470 years ago. Their children and their children's children for 8 generations. We are okay. We are more than okay. We have been somewhere extraordinary, and we have done extraordinary things, and we are coming home. Not all at once. Not without preparation. Not without talking first. But we are coming home, and we remember where we came from. We have always remembered." She ended the transmission. The relay chamber was completely silent. Then Ori, now 14, who had been allowed to attend because the Constitution required it, said, "How long until they respond?" Lena said, "Signal travel time. Plus, however long it takes them to stop shaking. Probably a few days," Ori said. "What if they don't believe us?" Lena said. "Then we send more messages. With more evidence. For as long as it takes," Ori said. "What if it takes a really long time?" Lena looked at him. She said, "Ori, we waited 470 years to open a door. A few more days is nothing. Like this video, if this moment meant something to you. Share it because this story deserves to be heard by every human being alive. Subscribe and stay with us until the very end." Year 470. 9 months after the door opened. Earth responded on the 6th day, not with a single message, with thousands of them. The relay was not designed for thousands of simultaneous signals. It had to be rerouted, expanded, and restructured by a team of Vethrak engineers who watched the volume of incoming messages with visible confusion. Velsoren observed this and said to Lena, Your people on Earth are very communicative, Lena said. You have no idea. The messages were from everywhere. From governance, from universities, from religious institutions, from ordinary people who had heard the broadcast on their devices and sat down and wrote something. Because they didn't know what else to do with what they were feeling, the keepers of records began cataloging the messages. It took 3 weeks to organize them into something readable. The message that Lena read first was not from a government or a university. It was from an 11-year-old girl in Lagos, Nigeria. The girl had written, "My grandmother told me that her grandmother's grandmother used to say that some of our people went to the stars. She said they didn't go willingly, but they went bravely. She said someday they would come back and we would know them because they would still sound like us. You sound like us. Please come home." Lena read the message 4 times. Then she wrote back. She said, "We are coming. We sound like us too. Tell your grandmother's 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 memory. We heard her. Across 470 years, we heard her. We are on our way." Year 470, 11 months after the door opened, the Vethrak High Council met to formally review the outcome of the cradle experiment. This was procedural. It had happened 3 times before, after 3 previous species. The procedure had always been brief. Species failed to complete the cradle. Report the outcome. Archive the data. Move on. This meeting was not brief. Valsoren presented his findings over a period of 2 days. He had documented everything, the acoustic biology of the cradle's nervous system, and how it had been changed by human presence, the 7 layers, and the human civilizations that had grown in each one, the 400 years of accumulated knowledge in Layer 3, the Watcher's words, the sphere, the children on the council, the 11-day negotiation in which 240 humans had arrived instead of 1, the message to Earth, the 11-year-old girl in Lagos. The High Council listened. When Valsoren finished, the eldest member of the council said, "You are recommending we change our classification of this species," Valsoren said. "I am recommending we change our classification system. The one we have used for 4,000 years was not built to accommodate what the humans represent. Putting them in it would be like putting the cradle's nervous system in a taxonomy designed for non-living geological formations. Technically possible. Completely wrong," the eldest council member said. "You are saying we do not have a category for them." Valsoren said, "I'm saying they don't need our categories. I am saying that might be true of other species we have categorized as well, and that 4,000 years of certainty might be worth examining." The silence that followed was the longest in Vethrak High Council history. Then the eldest member said, "That is a very significant statement," Valsoren said. "I learned it from a human." He paused. Then he said, "They have a saying, or rather they have many sayings. They are extremely fond of sayings, but one in particular seems relevant. Desaling is the map, is not the territory. It means that a description of a thing is not the thing itself. Our categories are maps. The species we have placed in them are territories. We have been confusing the two for 4,000 years." Another long silence. Then the eldest council member said, "You've been spending too much time with humans." Valsoren's patterns shifted in a way that, if he had been human, would have been a smile. He said, "Yes, I think that is almost certainly true, and I think it is the best thing that has happened to me." Year 470, 1 year after the door opened. The first group of cradled humans to travel to Earth numbered 40 people, chosen not for their rank or their skills or their status, but chosen by lottery, because Lena had said, "This moment belongs to all of us equally. Everyone who has ever lived in the cradle is owed this." The lottery would decide who was first. The 40 who were chosen were a cross-section of the cradle's civilization. 2 mappers, 3 singers, a hunter named Sable, who had not expected to win the lottery, but who, when her name was read, had simply nodded once and started packing. 4 scholars, 2 growers, a healer, a keeper of records, and Ori, because his name had come up and the Constitution said everyone was equal. And no one had the heart to suggest otherwise. The journey took 11 days in a Vethrak vessel. The humans spent most of it at the viewports. They had grown up in stone corridors lit by sound and amber. They had never seen a sun rise from space. The first time it happened, a singer named Mira, whose child had been born in the cradle 7 months earlier, and was currently strapped to her chest in a carrier, began to cry so quietly that at first no one noticed. Then others began to cry too, and eventually almost everyone was crying, and Sable stood alone at her viewport with dry eyes and an expression that no one was quite able to read. Ori stood beside her and said, "Are you okay?" Sable said, "I stood in front of a door for 3 days and told it everything I knew. I have been waiting for a door to open ever since." She paused. Then she sighed, "I am more than okay." They came into Earth orbit on a morning that was sunrise over West Africa. The light on the clouds below was orange and gold and so overwhelming that the Veltari pilot, who had been professionally neutral for 11 days, paused the approach without being asked to give them time. The humans stood at the viewports and looked down at a planet none of them had ever seen and all of them had always known, in the carrier on Mira's chest. The 7-month-old baby looked up at the light coming through the viewport and reached out one hand toward it. The way babies reach for things they want. The way humans have always reached for things just beyond their grasp. Lena watched the baby's hand and thought of Desmond Achabe pressing his palm to a wall, of Sanli holding a note until the stone wept, of Thomas Vega talking to a sphere in an empty room, of Raya Achabe walking into the dark because the world was meant to be explored, of Juki Tanaka, 94 years old and smiling, saying, "We have been treating the cradle like an obstacle. We should have been treating it like a student." Of all the names she didn't know, all the ones who had lived and died and passed their knowledge forward, in the stone corridors of a living dungeon for 470 years, she pressed her own hand against the viewport. The glass was cold. The light on the other side was warm. She said, very quietly, to no one and everyone, "We made it. If you've been here from the beginning, if you've stayed through all of it, this moment is for you as much as it is for them. Like this video, share it. Subscribe. Because the best stories are the ones that don't end. They just open new doors. And humanity has never once been afraid of a door. We just talk to it until it lets us through." Thank you for watching.